Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Kris Sims, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, her website taxpayer.com. Welcome back to the show, Kris.
Thanks for having us.
Kris, the BC government wants to charge anyone asking for a Freedom of Information request $25 per request. They call that a modest fee. This is at a time when media outlets are bleeding red ink, newsrooms are closing or laying off all their staff, and of course, independent journalists like myself. $25? For me, that's a fortune.
It absolutely is, and this is a joke. They should not be doing this. Frankly, the vast majority of this information should already just be posted online. Proactive disclosure is what the fancy people call it. We shouldn't even need to ask for this information. It should just be posted. And then, if you actually have to file a Freedom of Information request, if folks who are listening don't know what that is, it's basically anything that is taxpayer funded, so, front-facing government, some crown corporations, all that stuff. You should be allowed to ask for information based on that because it's your money going into it. So in those cases, you can ask for things like term papers, contracts, receipts, emails, even draft agendas and stuff is sometimes useful. And you ask for that data in order to find out what they're up to and how they're spending your money. For example, we had filed at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation a Freedom of Information request with TransLink. Because you might remember at the very beginning of the horrible crisis we're dealing with now, that they announced that their salaries of their executives, even the top mucky mucks, were taking a 10% cut in solidarity because they were all in this together, right? So we filed FOIs to find out, how much money was that, and did you actually take that pay cut? Turns out they didn't. Shortly after they made that announcement, the big federal money train came through and dumped a whole bunch of cash on British Columbia. TransLink quietly took a chunk of that and made that top their salaries back up. So it was a cut in name only. It was only on paper. They got all sorts of awesome, accolade-type headlines for doing the cut and nary a peep about actually bumping their salaries back up. So that's the kind of stuff that FOI will get you. When you remember, of course, the excellent reporter at Kamloops this week, the news reporter there, she did a year of Freedom of Information requests on the Thompson River Nicola group, which is basically their, committee of the whole. It's the regional district that oversees the area around Kamloops. It was through FOI and access to information laws that she was able to get all those receipts about the fancy dinners and the booze and the champagne room at Whistler and the hotels, all that stuff. If you start muzzling and chilling those newsrooms and independent journalists like yourselves and activist groups like us, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, then you are going to rob people of information. You are going to be able to work in the fog and in the dark, and you won't have to answer nearly as many uncomfortable questions. And so that is why it is fundamental that we fight on this stuff. And for folks who are saying, it's $25, that is a big amount of money, especially when you consider how many FOI requests you can put in. I think last year I sent in, more than 130 or so FOIs to various levels of government. And sometimes you don't get anything back. Other times, you catch them misusing your money. And it's important to be able to find that stuff out. And so that's why there is no way that Premier Horgan should let this stand, especially considering that he's greatly expanded the budget of his own office. I think the difference between this budget that he's using to run his own office and the budget from a couple of years ago is close to $4 million. And he was spending money on a super fancy rock star type TV studio in Victoria, even though there's several perfectly functional facilities for him to do video conferences and press conferences out of. That was taxpayers' money again there too. So this is nonsense. They need to repeal this right away in the name of transparency and accountability.
Now, of course, a lot of people say, well, it's just a self-interested journalist who doesn't want to pay a legitimate fee. But we can really see how this would stifle even the average person's attempt, because it's not just one filing. You have to pay that fee for every document you ask for.
That's correct.
And Bob Mack, an investigative journalist, friend of the show,
yep.
Right now he has to pay $10 for each inquiry he makes about real estate records. And again, you know, the old journalism saying of follow the money. Well, real estate quite often will give you a fine trail of money laundering, or who owns what and how did they get it and where did they get the money.
Yes,
so
exactly.
this just isn't a thing about that, but it really does seem to be, again, a stifling as the journalistic pool shrinks, as newsrooms either shrink and don't have regular legislative reporters or part-timers, or none now because they can't afford it. It just seems to be another slap in the face of the taxpayer, because I'm not asking on my behalf. I'm asking on your behalf, the listener. Like, should you be worried about this government spending? And even if I pay a fee, most likely I'm just going to get a blacked out page, and then I have to file an appeal and go through the Freedom of Information Commissioner, who maybe 5 or 6 years from now rules, yeah, the government should have given you the information.
Exactly. And by then it's mostly useless.
And they know
don't
that.
Want to hear it ananymore.
Yeah, they know. The
course
longer.
They know.
And how often, I know they're supposed to, the legislation says in a timely manner, but how often does that happen, where aren't they supposed to get it to you within a certain number of days? What is that number of days, and how often do they do that?
Great question. Yes, they are supposed to at least respond to it immediately and get it back to you within 30 days. And usually what happens in I can't really think of a time it hasn't happened with me. They come back to you on day 29 and say, we need an extension. And I think they can get 2 extensions before they have to start giving you some reasons for the extensions. And even then, they'll black stuff out. They will say that things are too personal to reveal. They can say that you're not being fair, to use layman's language, with your requests. They can appeal on their side for the Freedom of Information Commissioner. And if they find, actually, that your requests are too onerous and it's going to require a lot of staff time and digging, they can come back to you right now, as it currently stands, and ask you to pay a fee. That happens already. So the idea that if you send them, War and Peace, and you want them to write an encyclopedia set in their spare time, sure, a lot of reasonable people will say that's unreasonable. And they will come back and say, listen, this is going to take this amount of staff time. This is how much it'll cost. Do you still want to continue through? Please send your credit card payment or whatever. That's already how it works. So them turning around and saying at the very face of it, at the very front, your price of admission for one document, one piece of information that you shouldn't even need to ask for already, it should be posted on the internet, is going to cost you $25 a pop? This is not good. It's not good at all. It's part and parcel with the lack of accountability and the lack of transparency. And frankly, we shouldn't need to demand this. It's our money. Those are our dollars. The government and the bureaucrats and the crown corporations don't get to play investment banker and wheel and deal and mess around with taxpayers' money without being accountable for it. And great point with Bob Mackin. I know that he files tons of FOIs. I think I was reading, actually, if I recall this correctly, that he filed more Freedom of Information requests in a typical year than the rest of the parliamentary gallery in Victoria at the legislature combined. That's a big deal. We need more people who are investigative journalists who do that kind of homework, because it's all fun and games to be on TV and to, say quippy things, but if you don't have that level of journalism where you're digging and you're asking and you're poking, that kind of homework, then you don't have the depth to go along with your reporting.
Yeah, I've heard they've actually called this the anti-Bob Mackin bill.
Yeah, they actually named it apparently by name, which is crazy. We need more.
In other words, Bob is digging up so much dirt on these guys, they're designing a regulation to quell one inquisitive journalist from doing his job.
And if that's not alarming, then folks, you're asleep. Like, you need to speak up. I mean, I don't care who you voted for. Pick up the phone and call your MLA.
And Premier John Horgan, are you a liar? Because there are clips of him on television from when he was in the NDP opposition saying, oh no, you can't put fees on freedom of information because it quells the very information needed for a healthy democracy. So what changed your attitude? Why do you want an unhealthy democracy, John Horgan? Tell me.
This is what happens when, unfortunately, with every party, when politicians go from opposition to government. It's awful. And
has he reached a stage, I call it the arrogant stage.
Right?
Every time a government has been in power, you have to vote them out because they start getting arrogant and self-entitled. We're the ruling party. How dare you question us? It was like Brian Mulrooney's favorite line for reporters. How dare you ask that question? and I said to him, well, sir, I dare, and I'd appreciate it if you'd answer it.
Well, I hope he answered you, because you have every right to ask questions as a member of what we hope is still a free country.
Yeah, well, Brian Mulrooney was the master of attacking the questioner. But I've noticed now a lot of politicians have decided a lot of people don't like journalists for some reason. And so it's okay to attack them.
And see, this is where it comes down to these fundamental tools, okay? So say, just for argument's sake, that you really love the NDP and you think they're awesome and you generally lean towards the left and you like mostly left-wing journalists and you have mostly a left-wing kind of news feed going through your social media. Fine. Don't you still think that we need the blind tools of accountability and checks and balances in place so that if a more right-wing or conservative government comes into power and now they're the ones spending your money, that you need to be able to get the information out of them too? This is why these tools are required, because they have balance and they don't care what ideology you have. You have to be able to hold politicians of all stripe to account. And it just goes for classic. I mean, when John Horgan was in opposition, before he was premier, he used to rail against the carbon tax. He used to say that it was going to cost people too much to heat their homes and drive to work. That's back when it was, I think, about 3 cents a liter. He also said that, before he was first elected premier, that he wasn't going to impose an employer health tax. And then he did. So this happens all the time. You could look at this federally. You could look at previous governments in BC. This is why you need accountability tools, so that average people, just citizens off the street, and journalists and activist groups can ask for this information and get it in a timely manner. And so I urge everybody, doesn't matter what your stripe is, call your MLA, phone the Premier's office, and you tell them that they need to back off on this quickly. I think if people speak up loudly and quickly enough, that Horgan will decide, wait a minute, this was a recommendation from staff, I didn't really look over it too much, it's not a good idea. Let's get rid of it. I think he's got room to climb down here quickly, but we need to act quickly too.
And I'd be the first person to say, well, congratulations, you're actually doing something that you said you wouldn't do in the first place. Look at, I remember the BC Liberals. Now again, see, I'm not picking sides. When Mr. Hanson was the finance minister 3 months before the election, I said, are you going to bring in the harmonized sales tax? And he said, it's not on our radar. Well, 3 months after getting elected, so 6 months from then, they instituted the harmonized sales tax, which Bill Vander Zalm organized a referendum against and was successful. And it took them a year and a half to take that tax off, by the way. They had no trouble implementing it almost instantly, but dragged their feet getting rid of it. And so the next time I ran into Mr. Hanson, I said, there's something wrong with your radar set.
Yeah,
it's not on our radar.
You're obviously not seeing it 6 months out, and that's a major problem.
Yeah, again, you didn't know you were going to do it because my insiders were saying we're telling the business community, start retooling your tills to calculate the harmonized sales tax.
Sure. Or when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, during the last election, not this past most recent one, but the one before that, They said they had no intention of raising the federal carbon tax up past $50 a ton. And then a few weeks after, guess what? He's raising it up to $170 a ton within the next 9 years. And so, this happens frequently. This happens very frequently. And this is what makes people really jaded and cynical when it comes to politicians and politics. And so this is where, especially with this issue, I really urge people to push back quickly, because this is a key to holding people to account. So it's very similar to recall legislation, right? Or auditing abilities. So we need those blind, permanent, fundamental tools of checks and balances to be in place in politics and in halls of power. Otherwise, they'll just be able to do what they want in a fog, and we pay for it.
We'll have more with Kris Sims right after this.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Kris Sims. Kris, speaking of attacks on free speech, Surrey City Council has banned people putting political signs on their lawns, and it's because the mayor doesn't like the people who want to keep the RCMP in Surrey, and they're putting signs on their lawns that say, keep the RCMP in Surrey, instead of going to a more costly, smaller municipal police force.
Isn't that strange? We don't know what's going to cost more either way. If it's RCMP or Surrey Police, fine. But the idea of banning somebody expressing themselves in a non-vulgar manner on their front lawns, on their own property, is very odd. I don't actually recall any other examples of that. It reminds me of a few years ago. You might remember some strata councils wouldn't allow things like Canadian flags to be out on your porch, right? That sort of stuff. That's odd because it's your own house, and as long as it isn't profane, and which is actually against the law, you should be allowed to display what you want on your own property. And so I'd be very curious to see if this stands up to the inevitable challenges that will be raised against it. And again, if you want to have a sign that says, I dislike pipelines and all of them should be banned, or I want this police force to be in place and not that one, it's on your own property. You should be allowed to say what you want on your own property. So that's a big head scratcher to think that the mayor figures that that's their jurisdiction.
Doesn't that violate the Charter of Rights, freedom of speech?
Isn't it right there in freedom of expression? And again, it's not calling for, it's not hate speech. You're not calling for violence against an identifiable group. There are some limits on free speech.
Of course. That's
kind of a no-brainer. But saying that you'd want a specific police force over another in like a clear and concise manner, not using profanity, that's very strange.
What if
I don't know how they'd be able to let that stand.
What if I, in different grass seed or using a chalk thing, just had my lawn grow something that said, keep the RCMP in Surrey?
Right.
Did they ban
interesting because there's different activists and news outlets, for example, that get their speech stifled during election time. It's usually called the election gag law. And your ability to express yourself at election time is actually quite curtailed. They really hammer down on how much money you can spend while expressing yourself. So if you want to put up a billboard, stuff like that, there's a big chill on it in Alberta, for example, that province. It's very difficult to speak up, especially around what they consider to be a writ period. And that's where you see some people, naming the titles of their books, something like Keep the RCMP in Surrey, and then putting out an advertisement for that book, right? That's it's silly that we would even need to get around it using those terms. They should just be able to say what they want as long as it's nothing that's illegal or harmful.
And this is on your own private property. Can't you post messages on your own property?
Sure. This is the thing.
And you're not doing it for profit either. This isn't a billboard where you're making money.
Exactly. So, for example, after an election, typically candidates need to go out and pick up all their lawn signs everywhere within 24 hours. And that includes, obviously, public spaces. So intersections, the sides of rural roads, all that stuff where it isn't somebody's private property per se. They still need to clean them all up. But if you want to keep a sign in your front lawn, typically, that's okay. Like there are activist groups that have what look like election signs, very similar to these RCMP ones. They're just a kind of chloroplast plastic, right? And they stick into the lawn. There are groups that are pro-pipeline and anti-pipeline, that are, pro-carbon tax and anti-carbon tax. Like, we're not picking a side here, but you should be allowed to express yourself freely. So that's super big head scratcher there.
Of course, the people against removing the RCMP from Surrey say they will challenge this in court. But I thought the Charter of Rights and Freedoms being a federal bill, that overrides anything by a lower government. The right of ultra vires, they call it legally in the courts, but it just means the right of the crown. The federal government outranks the provincial government, who outranks the municipal government.
Usually, yeah. But what's interesting is that it takes so long to get all the way up to the federal level and to make these sorts of challenges. So maybe... Well,
I would try to get a ticket right away then, so I can have a judge quash it right at the start.
Yeah, we'll see. Unfortunately, we're seeing a massive backlog in most courts. So be curious to see if they'd be able to try to get rid of it. Maybe they've put through this knowing that it'll take too long in court, and by then, whatever it is that they want to do with this will be done.
Now there's a political reason for doing this, and if you have a bylaw officer enforce something that's political, is that abuse of power?
Great question. And is it a good use of resources?
Yeah.
Right? Like, don't we have other things for bylaw enforcement to be dealing with? I mean, Surrey isn't dealing with the same kind of, window smashing that downtown Vancouver is, unfortunately. But I hear from people frequently, including in places that, like Surrey, that they live in, that there's all sorts of problems that they have that bylaw could be busying themselves with. Not, knocking on Marcy's door and telling Marcy to remove her I support the RCMP sign from her own front lawn. We'll have to see what happens with the mayor and his popularity because of this.
Now, another thing that has to do with freedom of speech, the censorship bills that the Trudeau government is proposing. Can you tell us about that? Internet censorship.
Yes. Again, this is something, I'm sorry to sound so alarmed over all these things. I know it can get depressing, but we're in it. Like, if you're going to, as Winston Churchill said, if you're going through hell, keep going. So, we have to deal with this. We've got Bill C-10, which is all about internet censorship, basically what you can and can't say online. And then along with that is another bill. It's frequently referred to as the Online Harms Bill. Now, in a nutshell, what this would do is allow for the CRTC, so the current CRTC that usually deals with radio broadcasts and television broadcasts, they would then have power over what you put on, say, Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, especially when it comes to videos. So, these independent journalists or startups or, activist groups and NGOs, all of that, or just your average person doing a rant camera, posting their video on Facebook, that will have a chilling effect because if it's passed the way it is right now, groups and platforms like Facebook could face massive fines, like potentially millions of dollars, if the state, if the government, if bureaucrats say that was not allowed speech. Now, to be clear, it is already illegal to do horrendous things such as post pictures of child sexual abuse online. That's obviously illegal. It's in the criminal code. Calling for harm against an identifiable group, again, already in the criminal code. Inciting terrorism, obviously in the criminal code. That's not what we're talking about here. This is another layer entirely, and it's under the banner of the Canadian Heritage Ministry, not Justice Ministry. And so this will have a huge chill on what you can and can't say online, because what company wants to take on the liability of potentially millions of dollars in fines just for allowing you, Joe and Sally Canadian, to say your piece? That's not worth it for them. They'd rather you just, share recipes and cat videos and, let's go Brandon slogans, right? That's the issue. And so we can't allow this to happen. We're calling on everybody from opposite political perspectives too to speak out against this. Because once you allow the government to decide how you can express yourself online, that's when you just fall all the way down that slippery slope. You're not going to be able to express yourself. You won't be able to gather online and share ideas. You won't be able to argue and debate with each other online. You won't be able to get, your supporters rallied. You won't be able to, for example, have physical rallies that you've organized already online, because that could all get frozen out. So folks need to actually act on this quickly, because right now, that last election, it's almost exactly the same as the last one. So there's no brakes being hit here. We've got the NDP that's in the co-pilot seat, and so far they're not fighting this, and they need to. All of the opposition parties in the House need to speak up against Bill C-10 and the online harms bill, because once these powers are in place, it's going to be a dickens of a time trying to uproot and get rid of them.
Vancouver City Hall and municipalities around the Lower Mainland, I believe, did the right thing when they allowed restaurants and pubs to open up new patio spaces. People really like dining outdoors. When it comes to the spread of disease, it's much safer for the clients to be outdoors and for the staff. But the one thing, so Vancouver said, yeah, we're going to allow those patios again next good weather season, whenever that happens in Vancouver, usually sometime after May when the rain stops. Mm-hmm. But they're going to charge $250, I believe, to apply for that patio. Why does the city want to kick another business sector in the face when it's already down?
This is one of those weird things where I think the folks at City Hall in some cases think that this money just magically comes from a business. That somehow if you're a business owner that you're like Daddy Warbucks and the sky's the limit, and it doesn't matter. They shouldn't be nickel and diming. They shouldn't be charging for these sorts of things. The better way to go about it is by default allow a restaurant, which already has permits, up the nose. They've got business permits, they've got liquor permits, they've got all that stuff, health and safety. Allow them by default to have a patio. If it is a problem they usually wouldn't do this, if it's somehow impeding access for people with disabilities or people can't get their strollers around it or something like that, something that defies common sense, then action should be taken. But by default, businesses should be able to have patios. Why is it that we're constantly having to seek permission from government and pay for all of these things at every step of the way? Especially when these businesses are already struggling. They're already trying to recover from this crisis that we're still in the middle of. And then on top of that, there's all sorts of crazy taxes now based on, best use. They're planning for mobility pricing or building a toll wall virtually around downtown. Things aren't looking a lot brighter on the horizon. And so people need to push back in the same way that they push back against the big parking fees that city staff were trying to put forward, and that the mayor, interestingly enough, voted against. So that was put to bed. They decided to not do that yet. And so the same sort of mobilization and pushback needs to happen here. If you really like your local restaurants, then help them out. Save them $250. Phone City Hall. Tell them to waive those fees.
Was it Port Coquitlam who actually had city staff help people put up their patios if that particular
yes, that's
city?
What I recall.
Yeah.
I remember Brad West talking about that online and on a couple of radio shows. Apparently, and I have not done a deep dive on this, so I don't know how frequently it happened, but yeah, apparently, not only were you allowed to have your patio by default, as I just described, so within the parameters of common sense, don't be a jerk, don't take over the sidewalk, all that stuff. Apparently, yeah, if the city staff, maintenance people were out and about, when they were finished filling up flower beds and stuff and filling in potholes, he sent them along to go help people construct the patios.
Yeah, because we've all seen those crews where there's one guy shoveling and 6 watching.
They're observing. And so, yeah, that was apparently what they were doing in Port Coquitlam. We need more of that kind of innovation and just common sense because, 1, it makes the businesses feel much better. 2, it saves them a lot of money. And 3, it uses your resources wisely and in a way that you would do yourself. More governments need to apply basic common sense to their decisions and their spending the same way they would, hopefully, in their own households and not just treat it as an ATM.
Wow. So, we have some kudos and, hey, what are you doings there?
Yes.
We should have segments in the show called, hey, way to go, and hey, what the hell you doing there?
Let it be so.
Now, Kris, if people would like to comment on what we've talked about, or if they have any suggestions for you, what should they do?
Oh, we would love to hear from you. We've got a very thorough, long-standing website. It's at taxpayer.com, so not plural, taxpayer.com. And if you head up there, you can see all sorts of commentary. You can sign petitions about stuff that's really bothering you. So things, for example, like being against C10, being against a home equity tax, being against the carbon tax, stuff like that, whatever you're most interested in. And what's really great that I love about it is that there's a toolkit on there for you. So that, if you want to have more action done in your local community, there's a good way of how to write a strong letter, how to send that email, how to even have a meeting with your elected representative, how to make that firm but polite phone call. And it's really empowering. I know a lot of people right now are struggling, both financially and, frankly, it's depressing with what's going on. So it's a really good way of feeling that you can take back some of your agency and speak up. So, for example, if you want the House of Commons reconvened before the end of November and you don't want your cabinet ministers wandering around taking pictures of red chairs, the way we see the health minister doing right now, it's a good way of pushing back. So head up to our website and you can download the toolkit.
Kris, thank you so much for being on the Goddard Report.
Thank you for caring.
My guest has been Kris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Her website, taxpayer.com. Kris, is there an email people can contact you at?
You betcha. They can email me directly. It's ksims, K-S-I-M-S, at taxpayer.com.
And if you have any questions for Kris, we'll ask that question for you as well if you send it to info@howstreet.com. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. We're also on Facebook. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.